It was pouring rain that night. I stood at the gate of my own house, a suitcase at my feet. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, slammed the lock from the inside. Her voice cut through the storm. "It's over. This house is ours now." Behind her stood my son David, clutching an old childhood photo. His eyes torn with guilt, but his lips sealed shut. I stared at the darkened windows, my heart breaking, but my will unshaken. They thought I was finished, but the house still had one last truth to tell. If you were in my place, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. That house was never just a building. It was where Anna, my late wife, and I poured every drop of sweat into bricks and timber, where every room still carried her laughter and warmth. When the door slammed shut in my face, I wasn't just locked out of four walls. I was facing the end of my life's legacy, and the cruelest part was that betrayal came from my own blood. I'm Henry, 72 years old, a carpenter by trade, a stubborn man by nature. I built furniture with my hands, and one day I built a home that became a sanctuary for my family. Anna and I started with nothing but grit and a dream. Together, we bought a piece of land, stacked stone upon stone, and carved a life inside those walls. For decades, that house was alive. Birthday candles were blown out in the kitchen. Christmas trees lit up the living room. Arguments, reconciliations, and laughter echoed down its hallways. And when Anna passed, the house became more than shelter. It became her voice, her presence lingering in every creak of the floorboards. I thought my children would understand that. But greed has a way of twisting blood into strangers. David, my son, was once a boy who followed me around with toy hammers, asking if he could help build. He grew into a man, but never one who stood firmly on his own. He tried his hand at business, investing in ventures he barely understood. Failed partnerships, debts piling up, promises broken. And with every stumble, he leaned harder on Melissa, his wife. Melissa. She entered our family with a smile that fooled everyone. To outsiders, she was polite, ambitious, determined. But behind closed doors, I saw calculation in her eyes. She had a way of scanning the room, as if measuring its worth, assigning a dollar value to memories that were priceless to me. The truth was, Melissa's ambitions cost money she didn't have. Credit cards maxed out, a failed boutique business, and most damning, an IRS letter demanding back taxes, interest, and penalties. She hid it from David, terrified he'd realize she had gambled away their stability. Foreclosure notices from the bank piled up. Every phone call seemed to be a creditor demanding payment. So she turned her gaze on the house. My house. The last card left to play. "Dad," she'd say, voice syrupy sweet, "you should really think about getting your estate in order. You wouldn't want David and Emma to be stuck fighting in court later." Her words sounded caring, but her eyes told the truth. She wanted me to sign papers that would put the deed under David's name and, by extension, hers. One evening, she took it further. She brought a notary to the house, a man in a gray suit, briefcase in hand, the smell of ink and paper trailing behind him. He set the documents on the dining table, pulled out his stamp, laid a pen right in front of me. "Sir," he said in that practiced voice of authority, "this is routine. Refusing to sign now could cause years of legal disputes for your children. Everyone your age secures their estate this way." Behind him stood two acquaintances, witnesses she called them. Their folded arms and stony faces were meant to intimidate. Melissa leaned in, smiling like she'd already won. "All you need is your signature, Dad. Think of the family. Think of the future." My hand trembled, not from weakness, but from rage. I pushed the pen back across the table. "No, this house is mine. I won't sign away my life." The notary looked annoyed. Melissa's smile cracked. David sat, silent, eyes fixed on the floor. That night, the dinner table was silent, knives and forks clinking against plates like drumbeats of tension. Melissa's voice eventually cut through. "You're being unreasonable, Dad. This house will be ours anyway. Why make it harder?" I stared at her. "This house is not yours to take." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside, and yet I didn't realize just how far Melissa was willing to go. The weeks that followed felt like living under siege. Melissa's smile vanished, replaced by sharp words and veiled threats. Every conversation became a negotiation, every glance a challenge. David, my son, rarely met my eyes anymore. He was drowning in debt, though he wouldn't admit it to me. Creditors called the house phone, Bank letters arrived with bold red stamps. Final notice. He crumpled them up, tossing them into drawers, but I knew. I saw the desperation in his shoulders, the way he avoided the mailbox like it might bite him. Melissa fed that desperation. She whispered in his ear when they thought I wasn't listening. Their hushed arguments carried through the thin walls at night. Words like foreclosure, IRS, and no other choice echoed down the hallway. One night their voices grew louder than usual. Melissa, we can't wait anymore, David. If he doesn't sign, we lose everything. David, he's my father. He built this place with his hands. Melissa, then he should want to pass it down, don't you see? Once it's in your name, the creditors can't touch it the same way. It'll save us. David's voice broke. You're asking me to betray him, Melissa hissed. I'm asking you to survive. The next morning, David avoided me completely. He grabbed his keys, muttered something about meetings, and left. Melissa, however, stayed behind. She sat across from me in the living room, legs crossed, her eyes sharp. Dad, she said, we need to face reality. You're 72. You can't live here alone forever. The house is too big for you. You could have proper care. And once you're settled into a nice facility, we can take care of everything else peacefully. Her words chilled me. She wasn't asking. She was declaring. And when she said facility, I knew what she meant, a nursing home. My cane tapped against the floor as I steadied myself. I am not leaving this house, I said. My voice was low but steady. Melissa smiled thinly. We'll see. That night I barely slept. Shadows of Anna's laughter haunted the walls, and the thought of strangers boxing up her memories filled me with rage. But what cut deeper was David's silence. He wasn't fighting her. He wasn't protecting me. He was letting her pave the road to my exile. I thought of Emma then, my daughter. She had moved out years ago, building a life in another state. We spoke on the phone, but distance has a way of making children think parents are stronger than they are. I never told her how bad things had gotten, until Melissa pushed too far. One Sunday, she announced over breakfast, David and I toured a care facility yesterday. They have a room available. Bright windows, activities. It's the best option. The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. David flinched but said nothing. Melissa's smile was triumphant. For the first time in my life, I felt like a ghost at my own table. Invisible, unwanted, disposable. But fate has a way of sending allies when you least expect it. That very afternoon, Emma arrived. She carried a weekend bag, her face glowing from the sun outside, unaware of the storm inside these walls. She hugged me tightly, kissed my cheek, and said, "Surprise, Dad. I thought I'd spend a few days with you." Melissa's smile faltered. David looked away. I held Emma close, my heart both relieved and heavy. She didn't yet know. She didn't know the battle her father was fighting, not just for bricks and wood, but for dignity, for memory, for love. As she unpacked in her old bedroom, I stood in the hallway, cane in hand, and realized something. Melissa thought she had cornered me. David thought silence would save him. But with Emma home, I wasn't alone anymore. And sometimes one witness, one ally is enough to turn the tide. When Emma arrived, smiling and full of energy, it pulled me backwards straight into memory. Because for her, this house wasn't a battlefield yet. For her, it was still the place of birthday candles and late-night stories. I closed my eyes and the smell of sawdust returned. Decades earlier, when I was a younger man, my hands were my pride. With them, I built cabinets, chairs, tables, solid, sturdy pieces that families passed down for generations. But one project outshone them all: the house I built for Anna. I remember the first day we stood on the empty plot. The land wasn't much, a patch of weeds, uneven soil, and the rustle of trees at the edge. But Anna's eyes shone with vision. One day our children will run through these halls, she said, though no walls existed yet. We couldn't afford contractors, so I drew up sketches at the kitchen table of our tiny rented apartment. Weekends, evenings, every spare moment we poured ourselves into that house. Anna mixed mortar while I laid bricks. She painted beams while I hammered nails. We argued about wallpaper, laughed about leaky faucets, and celebrated every tiny milestone like it was Christmas. By the time the frame rose against the sky, neighbors began stopping by, shaking their heads. "You two are crazy," they'd say. "Building a house with your own hands, impossible." But Anna only smiled, brushing hair from her face. "It's not just a house," she'd reply. "It's proof we can build something out of nothing." And we did. Room by room, window by window. I carved the banister on the staircase myself, sanding it smooth until it gleamed. Anna insisted on a garden out front filled with roses and tulips. Every petal, every nail, every stone was a piece of us. Years later, when David was born, we brought him home through those doors. I still remember his tiny fists clenching the air, his cry echoing off the walls that had been silent for so long. Emma followed a few years later, and the house became noisy with laughter toys scattered across the floor. Anna's lullabies drifting through the hallways. Every holiday became tradition. Christmas meant stringing lights from the porch, David climbing halfway up the ladder before I shoot him down. Birthdays meant Anna baking cakes too large for the oven, frosting dripping as children squealed around the table. It was more than shelter, it was memory permanence. And Anna, she was the soul of it all. When she passed, the house became my lifeline. Her perfume lingered in the bedroom, the garden still bloomed with her flowers. Some nights I'd sit by the banister I carved and swear I heard her humming. That's why I couldn't sign it away. Not for money, not for convenience, and certainly not for Melissa. Melissa, when David introduced her, I wanted to be welcoming. She seemed bright, ambitious, polished. Emma, ever cautious, whispered to me once. She looks at things like she's counting them. I brushed it off at the time. I wanted to believe the best, but over the years I noticed it too. The way Melissa lingered on the antique clock in the hallway asking what it might be worth. The way she suggested modernizing the living room with renovations. Renovations she insisted should be financed by joint accounts. The way her compliments always carried an undertone of calculation. Anna would have seen through her in an instant. But by then Anna was gone, and my voice carried less weight against David's eagerness to please his wife. There was one moment that still echoes. It was Emma's last summer at home before college. She had friends over for a small party in the backyard. I remember grilling hamburgers, the smell of smoke drifting over the laughter. Melissa had joined, though she was still new to the family. At one point, she leaned against the porch watching Emma's friends explore the house. "Nice place," one of them said. Melissa's smile was tight. "Yes, and someday it'll all be ours." She said it casually, but I caught the gleam in her eyes. Emma caught it too. She pulled me aside, whispering, "Dad, did you hear that? She talks like the house is already hers." I told Emma not to worry, that people say things without meaning them, but in my gut I knew. Melissa saw the house not as memory but as prize, and she would wait as long as it took to claim it. There was a time, years before the storm you've just heard, when I first felt the ground shift beneath my feet. It started with a simple suggestion: open concept. Melissa said, standing in my kitchen with a magazine folded on the quartz island that Anna and I had chosen decades ago. "Tear this wall down, brighten the space, add resale value. Resale value." The phrase landed like a stone in my stomach. "I'm not selling," I said. "Of course not." She smiled too quickly. "But smart families keep their options open." David repeated it later, almost word for word, like he'd practiced in the car. "It would be good for the house, Dad." I didn't hate the idea of repairs. We'd kept the roof tight and the wiring safe all these years. But the tone was different now. It wasn't about living better. It was about making the house market-friendly. I asked the simple question any carpenter asks: "Who's paying?" David hesitated. Melissa didn't. "We can use household money. It's all family, right?" Family. The softest word used to push the hardest agenda. I told them I would cover maintenance the way I always had, out of my account. An account I'd kept separate since before my marriage to Anna. Campbell once told me long ago that if you wanted to keep something separate, you needed a paper trail. And I had it. The deed, the mortgage, even the old personal loan statements from back when the house was drawn only on my name, years before Val. Years before kids. Still, Melissa pressed. She lined up contractors who spoke more to her than to me. She found a refinance deal that conveniently needed my signature and somehow moved title work to the center of the page. She pitched a reverse mortgage like it was a harmless tool. "It's just unlocking value," she said, brushing imaginary dust off my banister, the banister I'd carved by hand. "You deserve to enjoy what you built." "I enjoy it by living here," I said. That ended the conversation for that day. With Melissa, conversations were battles of inches. You didn't lose at once. You yielded small ground until you looked back and realized the fence had moved. The next month, an accidental delivery of backsplash tile arrived on my porch. Melissa shrugged. Non-refundable. Might as well use it. I paid the restocking fee myself and sent it back, not because tile is evil, but because of the principle I wouldn't be cornered into a decision by someone else's invoice. A week later, David brought over a folder, the kind with tabs. Budget, he said, just to get ideas on paper. I flipped through numbers that didn't fit our house but fit a realtor's dream stage, Space's modern fixtures. All the shine that photographed well and aged poorly. Dad, he said quietly, this would help us. Will it help the house? I asked. He didn't answer. That night I went to the basement, to the corner behind the old workbench where the light hangs low and the air always smells like cedar and thyme. I slid the footlocker out, the fireproof one, and checked everything the way I did every few years, like a ritual. Deed, mortgage, paid-off letters, the closing statement from the 70s with Campbell's name typed near the bottom, personal bank records, receipts for the original framing lumber. Even a thin file of photographs, me in a younger man's body, sweat-streaked, standing with Anna in front of framing studs like a pair of proud thieves who stole something back from the world. I kept those things not because I expected a war, but because a carpenter respects the record of his work. Measurements matter. The order of cuts matters. In a house, like in life, you don't mix two lines and expect them to stay straight. You know what else was in that box? A letter from Campbell written years after the house was already our home. Henry, he'd said, keep originals, keep dates. If you pay for improvements, label the source. Not because you're ever going to court, because clarity today prevents confusion tomorrow. I took his advice. When I replaced a section of roof, I paid from my account and clipped the bank statement behind the invoice. When I had the porch restained, I wrote the check from the same account, no detours. I didn't do that out of paranoia. I did it out of discipline. I built the house that way. I kept it that way. But Melissa didn't live by clarity. She lived by pressure. She wanted me tired, agreeable, warned by suggestion. She wanted the outcome title, shifted, leverage secured, so her past couldn't swallow her whole. Then came the day Emma left for college. She hugged me in the driveway for too long, the way daughters do when they realize home becomes a place they visit more than live. David and Melissa waved from the porch, and in that quiet afterward, the house felt larger than it had in years, full of echoes. That autumn, Melissa staged the first family meeting. She used phrases that sounded clinical: estate planning, tax efficiency, avoiding probate. She wasn't wrong that families should plan. She was wrong about who the planning was for. I tried to speak to David alone. We sat on the back steps with mugs of coffee, staring at the garden Anna planted, rose bushes that bloomed like a promise kept. Son, I said, when a home gets treated like a number, people become numbers too. He swallowed hard. I know. Do you? He nodded, but not in agreement, in escape. The kind of nod that ends a conversation before it gets to the hard part. Months passed. I fixed small things, a hinge here, a squeak there. I kept records. I cooked simple meals for myself and left a plate for David on the nights he stopped by after Melissa's late shifts. Some nights he ate in silence. Some nights he didn't come at all. Then the first IRS letter arrived for their household. I found it because David had stuffed it between coupons on the counter. I didn't open it, wasn't my right, but I read enough of the envelope to know bad news when I saw it. Not long after, a foreclosure warning came with the bank's logo like a bruise. Melissa changed after that. The mask slipped. Polite words turned barbed. It's irresponsible, she said one evening, for an old man to cling to a house he can't even mow properly. I mowed the lawn next morning at dawn. She arranged the notary visit soon after, the one with witnesses, the same theater I told you about. And though I refused, I saw something in David that day that scared me more than Melissa's ambition. I saw surrender. The kind of surrender that comes not from agreement, but from exhaustion. That was the day I called Campbell. Not for a fight, just for a conversation. He listened. He asked dates, names, amounts, the way lawyers measure truth. He reminded me gently of what he'd said years ago. Clarity today prevents confusion tomorrow. Then his tone changed, not as a lawyer, but as a friend. Henry, protect your records. If anyone claims the house is something it isn't, the paper will protect you when people won't. After that call, I made sure the footlocker was not just full, but organized. Tabs, labels, a timeline. Not because I was ready to go to war, because I finally admitted someone else already was. Emma visited less often in those days, distance work life. But when she did, she always walked straight to the banister, ran her hand along the curve I'd carved long ago, and smiled. Still the smoothest rail in the state, she'd say. We'd sit on the steps and talk about nothing and everything. Once she caught Melissa peering into the basement, the look of appraisal plain on her face. Emma waited until Melissa left and then whispered, "Dad, lock what matters." "I already did," I said. I wish that had been enough to stop what came next. But paper can't stop people. Not at first. Pressure kept building, whispers, plans, meetings I wasn't invited to. And then the line was crossed. The nursing home conversation slid from suggestion to schedule. That's when a house stops being a house and becomes a battlefield. That's when a father stops being a father and becomes an obstacle. If you're wondering why I didn't call the police, then I'll tell you what I told myself. Old men of my generation don't drag their families into the street. We fix things inside the walls we built. We protect our blood even when it bleeds us. But the truth is, sometimes the bravest thing isn't choosing the fight, it's choosing the moment. I waited. I watched. And I kept the paper. Because somewhere under the noise, under the threats and the plans and the locks, I believed what Anna always said when our hands were raw and the roof wasn't finished and the neighbors called us crazy. If we build it right, it will stand. I built it right. Now, I just had to prove it. It didn't take long after Emma's arrival for Melissa to escalate. She was clever like that, waiting until there were more witnesses in the house, waiting until emotions could be weaponized. One evening, she called for a family meeting. We sat around the dining table, me at the head, Emma to my left, David and Melissa across from me. Papers were stacked neatly in front of Melissa, a folder too polished for coincidence. "This is ridiculous," Emma muttered under her breath, already sensing what was coming. Melissa's smile was razor thin. "I've consulted a lawyer," she announced, placing the folder squarely in the middle. "And I think it's time we all face the truth." David shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't looked at me all night. Melissa flipped the folder open, spreading documents like playing cards. Legally, she said, drawing out the word, "This house is not solely Henry's, not anymore. The improvements made over the years, new roof, new wiring, remodeled kitchen, they were paid for at least in part with marital funds." I narrowed my eyes. "Marital funds?" She nodded. "Yes. Funds that David and I contributed to over time, which means the property has been commingled. And once it's commingled, it's considered marital property under the law." Emma sat forward, fire in her voice. "That's absurd. My dad kept records. He paid for those renovations himself. He's shown me the checks, the receipts." Melissa waved a manicured hand, dismissing her. "Receipts can be questioned. Memories fade. But legally, the principle of commingling is clear once separate property mixes with marital funds. The distinction vanishes." She leaned closer, eyes fixed on me like a predator. "You can resist if you want, Dad, but the law is not on your side." I felt Emma's hand slide into mine under the table, squeezing hard. "Melissa," I said quietly, "this house existed long before you ever stepped foot inside it." "True," she admitted. "But I married your son. His income became ours. Any money he spent here on repairs, updates, improvements bound me to this house too." Emma's voice sharpened. "You don't get to rewrite history. My father built this home. You married into it. That doesn't make it yours." Melissa smirked. "The law doesn't care who swung the hammer, sweetheart. It cares about documentation. And as far as I'm concerned, we have grounds to claim at least partial ownership." David finally spoke, voice low and uncertain. "Maybe we should listen to her dad. Maybe it's time to consider options." The words pierced deeper than any legal jargon. My son, my boy who once followed me with toy tools begging to help build this place, was now suggesting I surrender it. Emma's chair screeched back. She stood glaring at him. "How can you say that? This isn't about options, David. This is about respect, about family." He looked down at his hands, shame written across his face, but no courage behind it. Melissa sat back satisfied. "In the eyes of the law," she said, "this is no longer just Henry's house, and the sooner we all accept that, the sooner we can move forward." Her words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. For a moment I thought of Anna, her laughter, her garden, her hand in mine the day we laid the first brick. I thought of everything we'd built now reduced to lines on a legal document twisted to suit someone else's greed. I clenched my jaw, staring at Melissa. She thought she'd won the first battle, but the war had only just begun. If you were me sitting at that table hearing your daughter-in-law claim the house you built was no longer yours, would you fight or would you give up? Melissa called it a family meeting, her favorite phrase. She said it like a prayer, as though repeating it could turn theft into duty. Emma sat close beside me, tense as a drawn bow. David sat opposite, head low, fingers rubbing at his wedding ring. Melissa placed a thick folder on the table and slid one sheet across with a flourish. This, she said, her voice bright and casual, is power of attorney. From now on, I'm authorized to handle all of Henry's decisions, financial, medical, residential. It's official, notarized, legal. Emma snatched it before I could touch it. Her eyes raced across the page. Then she slammed it down. This isn't possible. My father didn't sign this. I leaned forward, anger rising. That's not my signature. That's not my hand. Melissa pointed to the red seal. It has a stamp, a notary seal. That makes it binding. Emma narrowed her eyes. How did you even get this through? A notary has to witness the person signing. Melissa's smile sharpened. Sometimes people trust what they're told. The notary saw an ID, saw a signature, and stamped it. Simple as that. Emma's voice rose. You mean you tricked her? You dragged in someone else, claimed it was my dad, and she didn't check carefully. That's not legal. That's negligence. Melissa shrugged. Negligence, mistake, oversight, call it whatever you like. The point is, the stamp is real. By the time anyone proves otherwise, the sale will already be complete. David finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. Melissa, maybe this has gone too far. Her head whipped toward him, her eyes narrowing. David froze, swallowed, and fell silent again. His shoulders slumped as if the air had been pulled from his lungs. Emma stood furious. I'm calling APS. This is elder abuse. Please do, Melissa said lightly, gathering her papers. They'll open a file, send a polite letter, maybe visit in a month. Bureaucracy doesn't sprint. Emma stepped into the hallway and dialed. I listened to the fragments of her conversation. Her voice was sharp at first, then faltered. She returned minutes later, face pale. They opened a case, gave me a file number, said a caseworker will be assigned within 2 to 3 weeks. I clenched my cane. Weeks? She'll have me in a facility and the house sold by Friday. Emma nodded, furious tears in her eyes. I told them that. They said they understand, but they can't act without process. Due process, they called it. Melissa smoothed her blouse, serene as ever. Exactly. Process takes time. I don't waste mine. Emma pointed at her, shaking. You're exploiting the gap. You know the system's slow. Melissa's smile widened. And that's why I win. While they shuffle papers, I move. I turn to David. Son, you know this is wrong. Say something. His eyes met mine for half a second, wet and guilty, before dropping to the floor again. His lips parted, but only a ragged whisper came out. Dad, I don't know how to stop it. You stop it by standing up, I said, by being the son your mother raised. Melissa's hand touched his shoulder, light but firm. He's standing with his family, with me. That's what loyalty looks like. Emma's face twisted. Loyalty to fraud. Melissa closed the folder with a snap. Call it fraud if it makes you feel better. By Friday morning, Henry will be settled into a safe, supervised facility. By Friday afternoon, the buyer signs the contract. And by Friday evening, the IRS, the bank, the credit cards, they all get their checks. That's what I call survival. I felt the weight of years pressed down, but inside something braced. You call it survival, I call it theft. Melissa leaned close, her voice dropping to a hiss. Call it whatever you like. The stamp says otherwise. Emma grabbed my hand, her grip firm. Dad, don't give up. We'll fight. We'll find the proof. APS can't move fast, but we can. I looked at her and nodded once, slow and certain. My daughter's fire was the only warmth left in that cold room. Melissa gathered her things and rose. Meeting over. Packing begins Thursday. The moving truck comes Friday at 10 sharp. She walked away, heels clicking against the floor. David remained in his chair, staring at his hands, silent. For the first time in my life, I saw my son not as weak, but as broken, a man so trapped in fear and debt that betrayal felt easier than resistance. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something else stir in me too. Not despair, not surrender, but resolve. It happened on a gray morning just 2 days after that so-called family meeting. I rose early, cane in hand, planning to fetch the newspaper like I had for decades. The grass was still wet with dew, the street quiet. But when I slid my key into the lock, the teeth scraped uselessly. I twisted harder, tried again. Nothing. The locks had been changed. Before I could knock, the door swung open. Melissa stood there in her robe, coffee steaming in her hand, her expression sweet as poison. "Oh," she said, casually, "didn't I mention we upgraded the locks last night? Security, you know. Can't be too careful." Emma came flying down the stairs, hair-tangled fury written across her face. "You can't do this. APS has already opened a case. They assigned us a file number. A caseworker will be here in 2 weeks." Melissa's smile barely moved. 2 weeks is forever in real estate. "By the time your government paper pushers show up, your father will be settled in a care facility and this house will be sold. APS is slow. I'm not." I tightened my grip on the cane heat rushing through my chest. "This is still my house." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "Not anymore. It's an asset and assets move." At that moment, David appeared in the hallway. He carried a battered suitcase, my suitcase. His hands trembled as he set it on the porch. His eyes darted between Melissa and me, torn, desperate. "Dad," his voice cracked, "I don't want this. I swear I don't, but I can't stop it." Emma rounded on him. "Yes, you can. You're his son. You could stand up to her just once." David's lips parted, but Melissa's hand brushed his shoulder, gentle but commanding. His mouth closed again. His shoulders collapsed. I looked at him, my son, my blood, and said softly, "David, the day you stop trying is the day you've already lost me." His eyes filled with tears. He whispered, broken, "Then maybe I lost you long before I lost this house." Emma gasped, the words cutting like glass. The scene drew attention. Mrs. Green, my neighbor of 30 years, paused on her morning walk, her terrier tugging at its leash. She stopped, staring at the suitcase at my feet. "Henry, are they putting you out? After all you've done for this street?" Melissa stiffened. "This is a private matter, Mrs. Green, family business." But blinds twitched open all along the block. A man watering his lawn stopped staring. Another neighbor whispered to his wife at their porch. Voices rose. "Did you see? They locked him out. After all those years building this place with his wife, that's elder abuse. Someone should call the paper." Mrs. Green shook her head loud enough for everyone to hear. "Shameful. Everyone will know what you did." Melissa's smile faltered for a flicker, then returned brittle. "People should mind their own homes." But the damage was done. The eviction wasn't private anymore. It was public, humiliating, undeniable. I bent, picking up the suitcase heavier than it should have been. It wasn't the clothes inside that weighed me down, but betrayal. My cane pressed deep into the porch boards as I steadied myself. I looked at David, who stood frozen in the doorway, face pale, shoulders hunched. He couldn't meet my eyes. He had already surrendered to debt, to fear, to Melissa. Melissa held the door wide, voice sharp now. "The facility is ready. Friday at 10. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I glanced past her into the hallway where Anna's laughter once lived, where birthdays and Christmas mornings had soaked into the walls. Now it was a stranger's house, and I was just a ghost on its porch. Mrs. Green lingered at the sidewalk, shaking her head. "You deserve better, Henry." I forced a nod, my throat tight. Then I looked at Melissa, at David, at the neighbors now murmuring along the street. "You think locks and papers will erase me?" I said quietly. "But you can't erase the truth. Houses don't fall because liars change the locks. They fall when the truth gives up. And I was not giving up. Not yet." That night the neighborhood wouldn't go quiet. I sat on a park bench with my suitcase at my feet, the metal slats pressing cold through my coat, and the street behind me still murmured with the aftershocks of a morning turned into spectacle. Curtains had opened like theater drapes, phones had been raised, whispers had carried. I hadn't just been locked out, I'd been locked out in front of an audience. Mrs. Green found us first. She crossed the grass with her little terrier and a thermos in her bag, like a nurse on a midnight shift. "Hot cocoa," she said, pressing steaming cups into our hands. I called my sister. She volunteers at the senior center. "She says what they did looks like elder abuse, plain as day. If you need me to give a statement, I will." "Thank you," Emma said, voice raw. "APS opened a file. We got a case number. They said a caseworker will be assigned in 2 to 3 weeks. Mrs. Green's jaw tightened. 2 to 3 weeks is exactly what that girl is counting on, Melissa," Emma said. "Melissa." Mrs. Green repeated, each syllable clipped like a nail. I'll speak to anyone who'll listen. The block will back you. People saw what happened. As if to prove her point, Emma's phone buzzed again and again. Texts from neighbors, a post on the neighborhood app. A couple from 3 doors down wrote, "We watched. We're disgusted. Tell us how to help. Someone else I can talk to, a reporter if needed." Another, "He built that home with his own hands. How can they do this?" I stared at the cocoa steaming in my hands and felt two things at once: shame that my humiliation had become public currency, and a small, unfamiliar warmth that strangers still recognized right from wrong. Emma scrolled, eyes shining and furious. They want updates. They want to know the APS case number so they can reference it if a reporter calls. They're asking if we filed with the state attorney general. Dad, they're ready to help. I nodded slowly. Help is good, but help isn't proof. Emma's shoulders slumped. I know. We spent the afternoon on the bench like castaways, our island made of shared hot drinks and colder facts. Emma called APS again to confirm the intake. A polite voice recited the process step by step as if reading from a laminated card. Case opened. Number assigned. Caseworker will be scheduled within 2 to 3 weeks. We may request documents. We will conduct interviews. Please understand we cannot intervene without due process. Due process! Emma repeated after the call, each consonant a pebble on her tongue. Meanwhile, Melissa changes the locks and books a moving van. I said nothing. My father taught me long ago that when a board splits, the first words you speak decide whether you fix it or make it worse. I listened instead, the wind in the trees. The small city sounds the hesitating hope in Emma's breath. By dusk, the neighborhood thread had become a chorus. People who remembered Anna's roses posted photos of them, sunlit and alive, like they were proof of something the law should understand, but never would. Someone linked an article on financial exploitation of elders. Someone else wrote, "Name the facility they want to send him to. We'll call." The street had become what streets in good towns sometimes become: a jury with no judge and a verdict with no teeth. "Dad," Emma said finally, "I know you hate being the center of this, but Mrs. Green's right. Public matters. Pressure matters. If APS's slow visibility is the only thing faster." I looked at the little flag someone had planted along the park path. After the 4th of July, still standing, colors a little faded but defiant. "Visibility without evidence is just noise," I said. "We need paper that holds when shouting stops." Emma leaned her head on my shoulder. "Then we get it. We measure twice. We bring more than the deed, more than memory. We bring what courts can't ignore." Her words opened a door inside me I hadn't realized Melissa had locked. I saw Anna again in the garden flower on her cheek, laughter stuck in the kitchen rafters. I heard her say what she always said when I worried a board wouldn't bear weight: if you build it right, it will stand. Maybe the neighbors were the scaffolding we hadn't known we needed. Maybe APS would come late but still come. Maybe Friday was a cliff and not the end. I lifted the cup to my lips, cocoa cooling, and felt the sting of wind on my face. "We won't shout to fill the silence," I told Emma. "We'll use it. We'll make the truth louder than the lies, not by volume but by weight." She slid her hand into mine. "Then we start tonight." The streetlights blinked on one by one like witnesses promising to keep watch. The next morning began with lists. Emma wrote them fast, neat, relentless: APS case number at the top. Then bullets: Attorney General complaint, state bar inquiry about the notary copies of my ID. From the past 10 years, bank statements, receipts, names of witnesses willing to speak. Mrs. Green texted 3 more neighbors who promised to confirm what they saw. The suitcase, the changed locks, the words Melissa used. Facility by Friday. We walked those lists like a job site, checking supports, marking weak points. The POA sat at the center like a rotten beam. If a notary had followed procedure, Melissa's trick would have died on the table. But the notary hadn't. Maybe she rushed, maybe she trusted, maybe she just assumed the woman with the confident voice and the folder knew what she was doing. "Negligence," Emma muttered, highlighting the word. "Not bribery. That's worse in a way. It means the system failed because someone stopped paying attention." I thought of all the times I'd scolded apprentices for measuring once, not because they were bad, but because they were busy. Rushing is the first cousin of ruin. She called APS again, not to argue but to document. Yes, we have witnesses, she told them. Yes, we can provide statements. Yes, we understand the timeline. She repeated the case number until it felt like a prayer. She called a legal aid clinic, then Campbell's office. She asked what kept judges from acting and what made them move. Two things Campbell said on the phone: clarity and urgency in writing. If we bring notarized history and a clean chain of separate funds, we can beat commingling. If we show imminent harm, we can slow the sale. Imminent harm, Emma said, writing it down. Friday at 10. Outside, the neighborhood's hum grew louder. A jogger slowed, recognizing me, and lifted a hand in a respectful salute. Someone left a paper sack near our bench, still warm muffins, a note tucked inside. We're with you. Another neighbor DM'd Emma, local columnist, is interested. Can I share your APS case number? I stared at the muffins like they were evidence of a stranger kind. When Anna got sick, I said people brought casseroles. Now they bring screenshots and phone trees. Maybe both are a kind of meal. Emma smiled, brief and sad. And both can keep you alive. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been living under her tongue since the first lock turned. Dad, is the way you're holding yourself silent as strength, or are you disappearing in front of me? I let the wind answer first. I watched the path where the early sun turned the dew on the grass into a thin film of light. When you're young, I said, silence feels like losing. When you're old, you learn it can be gathering. A carpenter doesn't pound every second. He measures, he marks, he waits for the exact blow that drives the nail true. She swallowed. And you think we're close to that blow? I pressed my palm to the worn curve of my cane, felt the groove where years had carved my grip. Closer today than yesterday. We have neighbors who will sign their names. We have APS with a file that exists in a system that can't pretend not to see. We have Campbell and a notarized history that outlives memory. Emma nodded, eyes steady now. Then we use all of it. We let the block talk. We let APS log. We let paper speak. And when it's time, I said we let the house speak. We sat in a quiet that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like coiled purpose, the kind that holds until it's stronger than the thing that tried to break it. Friday at 10 was a wall, but walls are just another surface to set a ladder against. Do you think staying silent is strength or weakness? Tell me what you believe in the comments. By Thursday night, the whispers had grown teeth. Emma's phone buzzed non-stop. Neighbors had turned the morning spectacle into a thread of outrage screenshots, hashtags, even talk of calling the local paper. One man on the street corner said flatly, "If apps drags their feet, the court of public opinion won't." It should have felt like victory. But I knew better. Noise rattles walls. It doesn't hold them up. What Melissa feared wasn't gossip. It was proof. I sat on the bench listening to Emma read another text. Mrs. Green says 2 more neighbors are willing to give written statements. They saw you locked out, saw David drop the suitcase. That's strong, Dad. That's real. I nodded, but my mind drifted elsewhere, back into the house itself. Somewhere in those walls sat the truth that could outlast Melissa's stamp APS delays, even the weight of neighbors' shame. Emma must have read my silence. What are you thinking? I gripped my cane, let the thought steady into words. I'm thinking we stop waiting for process to crawl. I'm thinking the basement still remembers. Her eyes widened. Dad, you mean... I mean tonight, I said. Before Friday comes, before the moving van, we go back, we take what's ours, quietly. The street was still when we slipped across. Melissa's car was gone, probably at a late showing with the realtor. David's truck wasn't there either, likely nursing shame at a bar. The porch light glowed faint but steady like a warning beacon. Emma's hands shook. What if she catches us? I gave her a tight smile. Then we remind her whose name is on the deed. The back door fought me, but age teaches tricks. A twist, a push with the cane, and the latch gave. The house sighed as I stepped inside. The air smelled the same polished dust, faint mildew, but colder somehow, as if stripped of welcome. I didn't linger. I headed straight for the basement. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight. Shadows clung to the corners, but the smell of sawdust greeted me like an old friend. There stood my workbench, scarred with decades of projects, the hammer still hanging where I'd left it, tools resting like soldiers on parade. And against the far wall, squat and faithful, the fireproof safe. I knelt, bones protesting, but my hands remembered the code as if no years had passed. Anna used to tease me, Henry, no one's going to break into our memories. She hadn't understood. What I locked away wasn't memory, it was defense. The dial clicked, the door swung open. There it was, the deed signed before my marriage, the mortgage inked only with my hand. Bank statements yellowed but legible, proving each major payment came from my separate account. Even Campbell's old letter reminding me, keep originals. One day clarity will matter. I ran my hand over the paper's edges, soft with age. For a heartbeat, I saw Anna in the corner, hair tied back, paint on her cheek, humming as she worked. I heard her voice clear as ever. If you build it right, it will stand. I stacked the documents carefully, slid them into a folder, tucked it into my satchel. My cane clattered as I rose, but my heart felt steadier than it had in weeks. At the top of the stairs, Emma's face appeared pale but fierce. Did you find it? I held the satchel high. I found the truth, and truth is heavier than locks. We slipped back into the night. Headlights appeared at the far corner, Melissa's car turning down the street. But by then we were already gone. My satchel clutched tight, the weight of paper stronger than steel. For the first time since they'd shoved me out, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a builder again, laying the first beam of a defense no one could knock down. Campbell's office smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, the kind of scent that made you believe truth could be stored and still hold weight. His desk was the same heavy oak as decades ago, scarred but solid like the man himself. I placed the satchel on the surface, my fingers trembling, not from weakness but from urgency. These, I said, are all I have left. He opened it carefully, unfolding each page with the precision of a surgeon. The deed, the mortgage, the bank statement's edges curled but legible. At last his eyes settled on the letter he had written me so many years before. Keep originals. Keep clarity. One day you may need them. A faint smile tugged at his lips. You listened. I did, I said. But will it be enough? Campbell leaned back, adjusting his glasses. Strong, Henry, very strong. The deed predates your marriage. The mortgage is in your name only. These statements show funds from your separate account. On paper, this is solid. Relief surged in my chest until his tone shifted. But he said, tapping the folder, the other side will scream commingling. They'll argue groceries, repairs, utilities, all the things couples share. A clever attorney can make mud out of clean water. Judges hesitate when they see gray. Emma bristled. So what you're saying, even this won't stop Melissa? Campbell sighed. It might slow her. But to end it, we need more. Something immune to spin, something no judge can doubt. He rose, walking to a high shelf where files sat in orderly rows. Pulling down a box, he set it on the desk and blew dust from its lid. His hands were slower now, but still deliberate. From within, he drew a single document in a plastic sleeve. The paper was yellowed, but the red notary seal glowed against the lamplight, unyielding. Emma leaned closer, her breath catching. What is that? Campbell's voice dropped calm and sure. A notarized copy of the original loan agreement. I witnessed it myself in the 70s. I kept a certified copy sealed under my archive. It proves beyond any dispute that the funds came from Henry's separate account. This isn't just evidence, it's foundation. He laid it flat on the desk. The seal gleamed like a brand of truth. My throat tightened. You kept it all these years. Campbell's eyes softened. Good lawyers keep clarity, Henry. Bad actors rely on fog. This, he tapped the sleeve, is clarity. Emma's hands trembled as she touched the edge of the plastic. So with this, the forged POA, the negligence of that notary, the commingling, lies, none of it can stand. Campbell nodded once. None of it can stand. When we put this before a judge, Melissa's stamp will look like a toy. Her story collapses under this weight. For weeks I had felt like a ghost wandering my own street, but now, holding that document, I felt solid again, like the builder I once was. My walls were upright, my beams were true. I pressed my palm to the sleeve, steady as bedrock. Then, let's build this case, I said. The way Anna and I built that house beam by beam until no storm can shake it. The living room no longer felt like a home. It was a courtroom without robes, a stage without curtains. Melissa sat on the sofa, papers stacked neatly at her side. A man in a suit, the prospective buyer, stood by the window, glancing at his watch. David hovered near Melissa, pale, hollow-eyed. You're just in time, Melissa said as Campbell, Emma, and I entered. The buyer is ready. One signature, and this house finally serves a purpose, clearing debts, saving us all. IRS foreclosure credit cards wiped clean. Emma's voice rang out sharp as glass. At the cost of your father's dignity, at the cost of the home he built? Melissa didn't flinch. This isn't about dignity, it's about survival. Old must give way so new can live. I stepped forward, cane tapping the floor like a gavel. I set my folder on the coffee table. This deed predates my marriage. This mortgage bears only my name. This house was mine before you ever stepped foot inside it. Melissa laughed brittle and high. Old scraps. Courts look at decades of shared expenses. Repairs, utilities commingling. That makes this marital property. That makes it ours. The buyer adjusted his tie as though agreeing. Emma's face tightened, fear flashing in her eyes. David rubbed his temple, muttering something under his breath. For a heartbeat, Melissa's triumph seemed unshakable. Then Campbell cleared his throat, calm as stone. "You're right," he said evenly. "If repairs had been paid with marital funds, you'd have an argument. But they weren't." Melissa frowned. "Excuse me?" Campbell opened his briefcase. He laid down records, canceled checks, receipts, all tied to my personal account. Then, with deliberate care, he drew out a plastic sleeve. Inside lay a yellowed page, its red notary seal still gleaming. "This," he said, "is a notarized copy of the original loan agreement. I witnessed it myself in the 70s. I archived a certified copy under my seal. It proves beyond dispute that this home was purchased and maintained with Henry's separate funds. No commingling, no marital claim." The room fell silent. The buyer stepped back, clearing his throat. Melissa's face drained of color. She reached for the document, but Campbell's hand pressed it flat. Emma gasped, clutching my arm, tears spilling. And David! David collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands. His voice cracked, words spilling like confession. "Every night I hear Mom's voice. She told me to protect him, to keep this house safe. And still I did nothing." Emma's fury exploded. "Nothing. You carried his suitcase to the porch. You let her lock him out like trash." David shook his head, tears dripping through his fingers. "I thought I was saving us, but all I did was bury him." Melissa snapped, voice shrill. "This isn't over. Judges can still." But her words frayed thin as paper. Even the buyer turned away, muttering, "I won't touch this deal." I straightened my cane, steady, my voice rising like a beam. "Set true. You forged my name. You tricked a notary. You rushed to change locks before the law could react. But the truth doesn't vanish because liars move fast. The truth waits. And when it speaks, it cannot be silenced." Emma wrapped her arms around me, whispering, "We still have each other, Dad. And this house." Through the window, neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, Mrs. Green among them. Some had phones raised. Others just watched, silent witnesses. Melissa glanced toward the glass, panic flickering across her face. The story was no longer private. It was public, undeniable. I turned back to her, my voice low but unyielding. "This house will stand. Because the truth always does." Would you ever forgive a betrayal like this? Or is some damage too deep to heal? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for the next story. Thank you for watching.